Bridge Pediatrics event today. So for those who haven't joined us before, I usually give a little overview of what Bridge is and what our aims are, and then we'll start the session. So Bridge was set up last year to be able to bridge the gap in postgraduate paediatric doctors in training's access to research by providing and sharing learning and awareness of the research that you can get involved with across the deanery, and by being a central hub to signpost you as trainees to available opportunities and research contacts throughout the deanery according to different special interests, and then providing educational opportunities like today for development of research skills and supporting any multi-centre research that you would like to start or get more widespread across the region, and quality improvement projects as well to run across the deanery. So today we look forward to an exciting talk by Dr. Tim Lee, who many of you know as a paediatric respiratory consultant at Leeds and who led the postgraduate diploma in child health. According to the website, he's been looking after children and young people with cystic fibrosis for about 30 years, since 1995. And he's the lead clinician and consultant at the Leeds Regional Paediatric Cystic Fibrosis Centre, with lots of experience with clinical trials, and been a principal investigator for lots of them, as well as working with the European Cystic Fibrosis Clinical Trial Network. And today he's telling us about what he's learned while developing an active clinical trial site with, for children with cystic fibrosis. So thank you for joining us today, and I'll let you take it from here. So I'll stop sharing, allow you to take over.
Thank you. So my presentation's just loading. Thank you for the invitation to speak, and I think it's brilliant having this this Bridge network to join people up and to learn more about research, because we didn't have anything like this in my day. I thought it'd be helpful because I've met some of you, but not all of you. It would help me to know a little bit about yourselves, if that's all right. So if people are happy to introduce themselves. So I will read out your names in order on my list here, and then perhaps if you could just say a little bit about who you are and what stage you're at in paediatrics, that would be really helpful. So my first person here is Eniola.
Hello, I'm Eniola, ST5 Pediatrics. I'm doing general pediatrics in Royal Infirmary at the moment.
Fantastic. Well, I've been exactly where you are, as you'll hear in a second, so that's great to hear from you. Thank you. And then there's Olubunmi.
Hi, my name is Olubunmi Busari. I'm ST6 in pediatrics. I'm currently doing gastro posting in Leeds Teaching Hospital. Thank you.
Fantastic. Lovely. And Oluchukwu.
Hi, my name is Oluchukwu. I'm a clinical fellow in Bedford Hospital.
Fantastic. Welcome. Then there's Neil.
Hi, I'm Neil Lyons. I'm ST4 Paediatrics at a programme from South Yorkshire, doing an NIHR doctoral research fellowship.
Fantastic. That sounds fascinating. We'll maybe find out more about that later. Salil?
Hi, I'm Salil Pradhan. I'm ST8 post-CCT now, currently in Bradford, about to join Leeds soon. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, Sophie?
Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm an ST2 trainee just at community in Calderdale at the moment, just wanting to know some more about some research stuff.
Brilliant. Yeah, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about when I was at ST2 level at the start of the talk, so that's really great. And Olushola?
My name is Shola Tedimola. I'm a transcript pediatrics at the Diana Princess of Wales Hospital.
Brilliant, great to hear from you. And then Verena, obviously no, but just remind us of where you're at the moment.
Yep, so I'm ST5 going on 6, and I'm currently at Hull neonatal unit.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, everybody. And it's great to hear the stage you're at. It helps me make sure my talk meets your needs. Hopefully you can see my first slide. This is the planned children's hospital we have for Leeds, but obviously it's on hold at the moment due to financial restraints in the government. But nonetheless, we have a children's cystic fibrosis centre in Clarendon Wing, as many of you will know who've worked in Leeds so far during the career. So obviously we've done slide 1 whilst it was loading, and that's really interesting to hear about the variety of people on the call. I thought I might do a poll to start off with, which is probably just for you to put answers in the chat. So which number do you feel comfortable with here? Would you say that clinical trials in paediatrics are an optional add-on for some paediatricians who like research? 2 should be an option for any patient as an embedded part of NHS care and treatment, and we all have responsibility to support and be involved if needed. 3 are too time-consuming for a busy NHS, and they're best that they're just done in other countries or just a few academic centres. Or would you feel more comfortable with just saying none of the above? So if you're happy just putting answers in the chat to what you think, where you feel comfortable putting an answer here. So we've got a lot of 2s. Okay. I think my journey in this has changed over time. So I think when I look back to when I was an ST1 equivalent in neonates at LGI, there was a clinical trial going on, and it was just such a busy unit. And I thought, how are we possibly able to fit in this and talking to parents about this study and all this kind of stuff when it's so busy just trying to get all the bloods done in time for the morning ward round and all of that. But I think over time, I have come much more to realise that actually clinical trials are really important, and that if we don't have clinical trials, care will never improve. And actually for many patients, clinical trials are a way of their care improving now, and not just being an altruistic thing to do for future care. And I hope my talk will illustrate some of that later on. So yeah, thank you for your contributions to voting there. So a little bit about me and how I got into research. So this is a picture of me when I was a foundation level doctor here at Leeds in 1994, looking quite a lot younger. And I qualified in medicine in Leeds in 1994. And I did an integrated degree in pharmacology, which actually has been very useful as I've got more into clinical trials as I've got on, but obviously isn't a prerequisite to get into clinical trials, but I have found it useful. And I did all my early ST1 to 3 equivalent training in Leeds. And actually, I did start, my first cystic fibrosis job was in 1995. So Verena, you're right, I have been in cystic fibrosis, although not exclusively cystic fibrosis, because obviously I was in training at the start, but for 30 years, which feels incredible, really, because I don't feel that old. I did my membership during that 3-year period, and as I mentioned, I did the cystic fibrosis job. And then I went to Hull. So great to have people from Hull on the call. And I did my ST4 to 5 equivalent core training, we called it then, in Hull, did neonates and general peds, and it got involved in the cystic fibrosis team in Hull as well during that time. And back then, I was one of the people that was on the postgraduate diploma in Child's Health as a student. And I did my master's project, which was kind of my first experience of research, really, on the Hull neonatal unit. And that was comparing the effectiveness of the routine neonatal examination, what we now call the NIPE, comparing the effectiveness of that being done by trainee paediatricians versus being done by adverse neonatal nurse practitioners. And actually what the results showed was that if you gave people training, which is what the neonatal nurse practitioners got at the time, they were more sensitive at picking up abnormalities on the newborn check, and that got published in Archives, and that whetted my appetite really for doing research. So I decided I wanted to follow an academic pathway, and for those of you already on academic pathway, like Neil, for example, don't know how this will have parallels to your journey, but basically at ST6, I was doing PICU in Leeds at that stage, and I applied for what was in those days called a lectureship, which is like an academic training post, and was successful for that. And that post was kind of 2/3 clinical, 1/3 academic, and a lot of that academic time was actually teaching the medical students, but also a bit of time to kind of think about research and do bits of research. And once I left PICU, I did a job that was split between cystic fibrosis and respiratory and the lecturer post. And I decided really what I wanted to do if I was to follow an academic pathway was try and do either an MD or a PhD and do some research, take some time out of program. And I was fortunate really to get linked in an opportunity to go and chat to a professor of molecular medicine in Leeds called Alex Markham, who I think has retired since. And he linked me in with an MRC fellowship application to do with improving the effectiveness of liposome-mediated gene therapy. So using some core proteins from adenovirus. Obviously, adenovirus is very good at delivering genetic material into cells, as many viruses are. And this was to use some of the core proteins from that virus to try and improve the effectiveness of liposome-mediated gene therapy, which is, of course, linked into cystic fibrosis, because cystic fibrosis needs new approaches, including potential gene therapy. So that MRC fellowship, I had to go for an interview in London at the MRC to see if I could be awarded this funding, and that was successful. So that was about £250,000 of funding to cover my salary and research costs for 3 years. But that was basically a lab-based project. So I learned how to do all sorts of lab techniques. And that was very different, obviously, to doing medicine. One morning a week, I still did a CF clinic here in Leeds to keep my hand in, as it were, on the clinical side. And I was fortunate that by the time I got to my CCT, which was in 2007, I'd already achieved 10 publications, either clinical publications like that neonatal one that I just mentioned, or PhD-related kind of scientific publications, and that was really good. And then once I was finishing my PhD, I went and did the respiratory grid interview because good training had just come in then, and got appointed with my completion grid training to a consultant in paediatric respiratory medicine in Leeds, which was an NHS post. I had some academic sessions, so obviously I was part of my job was to run the postgraduate diploma in child health, which Verena mentioned, alongside Mary Rudolph. And actually, interestingly, my job all the way through has been about half clinical and half academic, and that's possibly enabled me to do some of the other things that I've gone on to do. Feel free, if any questions come up at any point, to dive in. I don't mind being interrupted. So either just come on microphone or put something in the chat if anything comes to mind. So my first point that I wanted to kind of encourage people to think about is if you're keen on research, and it's great to have people here at all sorts of levels of training and career in paediatrics, do seriously think about trying to do an MD or a PhD as an out-of-program experience during your training. There are opportunities to do it within Yorkshire and Humber. There's lots of good contacts in many of our centres to take this on, and it sounds as though Neil's obviously on that achieved that as well, and is going down that route. So then I started as a consultant, and at that time there were lots of research projects going on in the cystic fibrosis team here in Leeds that were presented at conferences. Most of them were relatively small single-site projects, service evaluations, audits, and it was great that was going on, and that people were getting to present those small bits of research at conferences, because I think it's a really good experience. It's a good way into research. But there wasn't much in the way of involvement in multi-centre clinical trials here in Leeds, so our patients weren't really getting the opportunity to be involved in trials. And as you'll all be aware, having got pediatrics, it's a very serious condition with lots of pediatric morbidity and mortality. In particular, when I started as a consultant, we had teenagers dying on the wards of CF, end-stage respiratory failure. Unfortunately, we rarely see that, very rarely see that now. But it was a terrible condition back then. And as a consultant, you really feel those deaths. Well, anyone on the team feels the deaths, but I found it particularly heavy, potentially carrying the responsibility as a consultant for those young people. And it was very clear that in cystic fibrosis, we needed more clinical trials to improve outcomes and get better treatments for this condition. And indeed, our children in Leeds needed to be able to access these studies. So our first step in Leeds, and this was in conjunction with my consultant colleague at the time, who'd obviously been in post a lot longer than me, Steve Conway, was that we wrote a joint application to join the European Cystic Fibrosis Society Clinical Trial Network, so for Leeds to join as a site. And you'll see on this poster here that there are a number of sites across Europe, and Leeds was one of them. And the gold stars are the kind of initial sites that were in this network, and the green stars are later joining sites. You can see Leeds was one of the early sites to be in it. And that was great because we got to join in with steering committees and teleconferences with more experienced researchers around Europe. And we were starting to get sent feasibility surveys for clinical trials that were looking for new sites and to expand their sites. And that gave us opportunities. And we learned a lot from being in the network as well. So we replied to feasibilities about clinical trials, and then we were offered a clinical trial. And actually, we had no funded infrastructure for clinical trials. So I had no specific time to do clinical trials alongside my clinical and my teaching academic job. And we had no research nurses or research coordinators at that stage. So basically, it was myself and our CF clinic nurse, Carol, who's still on the team now, but in a more senior role, but back then was our CF clinic nurse, and was also keen for us to get going in clinical trials. So we were offered this randomized controlled trial of inhaled tiotropium in cystic fibrosis, which was Boehringer Ingelheim study. And this, with parental permission, is the young person. So we had one recruit to that study. This is the young person that was in the trial. As a result of being in that study, we got a bit of commercial income into the trust to cover the costs of the study, which obviously is important because these aren't, there's a lot of time involved in doing the study, and indeed costs in terms of blood taking equipment and the various other investigations that we need to do. As part of being in the study, I got to go to the European investigator meeting for the study in Paris, which was great to hear about the study in more detail and some of the other investigators from around Europe. We were actually approached by BBC Look North, who were interested in that we were starting to do clinical trials in Leeds, and we actually did a piece on the BBC about the study, and the young person appeared in that, and I appeared in that, and so on and so forth. So that was an interesting experience too, about kind of telling people about clinical trials. So the second learning point really is, to try and get research going, and develop a clinical trial site, you need enthusiasm within the clinical team. And for me, that was Carol principally at the start, but also other team members being positive about clinical research. And really, clinical trials need to be embedded in clinical care. So you don't want your academic bit to be separate from your clinical bit, in my view. You want the two to be hand in hand for clinical trials to be effective, because that's how you recruit people more effectively. That's how people feel more involved in clinical trials and more aware of clinical trial opportunities. So the next thing that happened was that the National Institute for Health Research wanted someone to lead for children's clinical research in West Yorkshire, because they wanted to start to develop more children's research nurses in West Yorkshire, because we had none at the time other than in paediatric oncology. And this was a job that was advertised as 2 clinical PAs, which is effectively 8 hours a week, a day a week, This was in 2010. So at that stage, I was on. I was doing 10 clinical sessions a week, and you can do up to 12. So I thought, well, I could do that. I think that might link in well with trying to develop clinical trials in Leeds. And this whole post was to try and create or for Yorkshire to become part of the national Medicine for Children Clinical Research Network, as was, which was the forerunner of NIHR Children's. And we had, along with my funding for a day a week, there was initial funding for 2 paediatric research nurses for Leeds. And so we interviewed and appointed 2 people, and that was Becky and Marjorie. And then we gradually developed funding for other West Yorkshire sites as well. And by about 2 or 3 years later, we developed this team. So we had research nurses across all the trusts in West Yorkshire. Some of these weren't full-time children's. Some of them were just, maybe a day a week children's who were doing adult research as well. Some of them doing clinical work, but then a day a week doing research, for example. And I was the kind of lead, and we had this great team, and we had Sarah as the network manager. We had Heather as a lead research nurse. And many of these people are still involved in research or have gone on into more senior clinical roles from being in the research team. But suddenly we had research nurses funded by the NIHR to support clinical trials, and that was great. And similarly in South and East Yorkshire, we had a team developed and funded. So we had the Sheffield Children's Research Team, and this is a kind of photo from that time with Professor Paul Dimitri in the middle and various other people that you may recognise. We had a lead research nurse and then research officers based at Sheffield Children's, Harrogate, etc. And I could show more pictures. There were people in Hull as well, and out towards Diana, Princess of Wales. We've got people on the call today. And this was an exciting time because I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but we built up quite quickly the amount of clinical research going on in the region. So you can see 2009 to 10 was our base year. And rapidly, this is South Yorkshire at the top. It went from 79 children involved in clinical trials, which is the Medicine for Children portfolio, kind of more than doubles in 2 or 3 years. And in West Yorkshire, went from baseline of 80, again, more than doubles, and more than tripled by year 4. So this was a really exciting time. Things were a bit slower in the northeast and North Lincolnshire, but nonetheless growing as well. It was a diverse portfolio covering all children's specialties apart from oncology and mental health. We had medicine for children was the kind of clinical trials aspect, and non-medicines was other studies, so that's qualitative research, registry type studies, blood testing, diagnostic studies, and things that weren't actually interventional studies. And a lot of these studies were multi-centre international studies, so that was really exciting. And back then, so this is about 10 years ago now, these were some of the sorts of studies that were open. I can't remember what all these acronyms are now, but I'm pretty sure SIFT was a neonatal study. ELFIN that was coming there was a neonatal study. We had a study on otitis media. We had studies in rheumatology. We had studies. Prednos was in nephrology. I honestly can't remember what trial it was about. SABRE was hypertonic saline for bronchiolitis, run out of Sheffield. It was a multi-centre study, and this was great. So we rolled that out across Yorkshire and Humber, and we were really keen that families, wherever they lived in Yorkshire and Humber, should have the opportunity to participate in the relevant studies if they wanted to, which is why I wanted research nurses in each and every place. And we're encouraging people and paediatric trainees in particular to take good clinical practice training so that you get a good clinical practice certificate, and then that gives you an opportunity to be on a delegation log for clinical trial and get involved in clinical trials. And hopefully some of you on this call have had the opportunity to do that. You'll be aware that your GCP training, you have to update every 2 or 3 years, depending on your trust, to stay valid. And that training is all about understanding the ethics of research, so making sure that people aren't coerced into doing clinical trials, that people know that they can leave a clinical trial at any point, and that the interests of the clinical trial participant are always first and foremost in any clinical trial. So, you know, whatever it takes to protect that subject's well-being is the primary concern in any clinical trial. You know, even if it means taking the person out of the clinical trial because it's not in their best interest to continue, the subject's best interests are always paramount. So that's what GCP is all about, if you've not encountered that training before. We were encouraging people at sites to approach us if they were approached by a sponsor, so that we can support them to do feasibility assessments and so on and so forth. And we're encouraging consultants and other relevant health professionals to lead on their own study where feasible. And then in terms of developing cystic fibrosis clinical research, our next step was to increase our resources at site for cystic fibrosis clinical trials. So we had the opportunity to apply to be part of the United Kingdom Cystic Fibrosis Clinical Trial Accelerator platform. And this was even better than the European Clinical Trial Network, because this came again with funding for research nurses. So again, it was a joint application we did with the Leeds Adult Cystic Fibrosis Unit, but we got we got a whole time funded CF specific research nurse for pediatrics for this, and adults got one for adults. And that was fantastic. So that enabled us to really have loads more capacity to do clinical trials. And over the last 10 years or so, these are some of the studies that we've been involved with. All of these are randomized, controlled, double-blind, multi-center international studies of various drugs. So you can see there was a nebulized liposomal amikacin to treat chronic Pseudomonas, a whole host of different CFTR modulator drugs, which were all oral drugs, and as well as them being randomized controlled trials, so we didn't know whether subjects were on placebo or actual treatment. Some of the endpoints were blinded to us as well. So, for example, sweat tests were an important endpoint because CFTR modulators changed the amount of salt in your sweat. We were blinded to the sweat chloride results, so that we couldn't automatically know who was on which, who was on active and who was on placebo in these studies. And you'll see that the age ranges of some of these trials become younger, and those trials are more intensive and more challenging. So you can imagine to do a modulator study in a 1 to 2 year old is very different to doing one in somebody that's 14. And now here at Leeds, most of our studies will have 4 or 5 children in each study. So we're recruiting loads more studies, and certainly one of our multi-center studies at the moment is a worldwide study. There are, I think, 18 sites worldwide, only 50 children in this study of a drug, and we've recruited 4 studies at our site, so we're recruiting over and above what you might expect. Nearly 10% of the worldwide population in the study being in Leeds, and that's very, very positive. So learning point 3 really is to develop an active clinical trial site. Understanding how to fund a research team is vital. So that's looking out for funding opportunities. Often these would be charitable opportunities or NIHR, government-funded research money. But you can't do this sort of thing on a shoestring. So it's being able to write applications and spot when funding calls are there, and thinking, do we need to do this jointly with adults? It would make a stronger case if we do it with adults, for example. Who else should we collaborate with, etc., etc. Just a reflection on what it's like doing clinical trials. So trial visits for drug trials are often long and involved. So most visits in our current clinical trials are for at least half a day for a child. Some of the visits are 8 or 9 hours in length. We have multiple endpoints, things like lung function, ECGs, sweat tests, blood tests. Some of those blood tests will be multiple blood tests through the day, so we might have a pre-dose level, a level of the drug at 2 hours, a level 4 hours post-dose, for example. Things like physical exam, obviously. The bloods that we take are sent by courier to a European central lab, which happens to be in Dublin. The sweat is actually flown to Utah in the States to be analysed. We obviously get funding from the commercial sponsor to cover the trial costs. So that is reinvested in our trial time. So I now have 4 hours a week funded time to do these studies that's within my job plan as a consultant, but is purely funded by commercial income from these studies. So that that is protected time in my working week to make sure that I'm fulfilling my principal investigator role. So that might be obviously supervising the clinical trial visits, but it's also then responding to blood results that are then sent back from the central lab, making sure patient safety is maintained at all times, dealing with any side effects of the medication or unexpected other things that happen to clinical trial participants, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot to do, but it's very worthwhile and rewarding. So I wanted to just mention a little bit about why clinical research is really needed in paediatrics. I think you'll all be aware that quite a lot of the drugs we use in paediatrics aren't necessarily licensed for paediatric use because the trial's never been done in the age group we're using it in. And therefore, for some medicines, we have a lack of evidence base for their efficacy and safety in children. Sometimes the formulations aren't particularly child-friendly. But fortunately, new regulations on paediatric drug licensing came into force in January 2007, which basically said to drug companies, if you want an exclusivity and a 10-year license to use this drug in adults, if it's a drug that would also be relevant to children, you have to study it in children. You have to do the clinical trials in children so that we can get the evidence in children, and children can have medicines that are actually proven to work in their age group. So that's been an incentive for pharma to actually do clinical trials much more in children, which is another reason that there's loads more clinical trials now than there were when I was a junior paediatric resident trainee. And there's lots of progress in lots of targeted biologics and pharmaceuticals, especially neuromuscular rheumatology and cystic fibrosis that I'm aware of, but I'm sure across all specialties within paediatrics. So I want to give a case of a child that's benefited from being in a clinical trial now, and this is again with parental permission. So this is a girl that I'm going to call Amy. That's not her real name, but this is her real photo, again with parental permission. And she was sadly a late diagnosis of cystic fibrosis at 2 years of age. She was missed on newborn screening. So by the time she was diagnosed by our centre, she already had very scarred and damaged lungs, sadly. And despite really intensive and committed CF treatment from her parents and from us as a CF team, her health was declining. So that by the age of 14 years, despite having 2 weeks of intravenous antibiotics every 8 weeks, so that's really frequently, and needing to sleep in oxygen at home at night, her lung function had dipped down to about 40% predicted, and she was coughing up blood quite frequently, which was quite a distressing symptom for her. And our worry was that that could get worse and that one of her episodes of hemoptysis could become life-threatening. The other thing is, once your lung function gets down to about 30–40% predicted, your predicted life expectancy in CF is of the order of 2 years. So you're really getting down towards end stage and thinking, should we be starting to think of a lung transplant and that kind of thing. So this was a very worrying stage for this young girl. And I'd been to the CF conference in Phoenix, Arizona, which is the big international CF conference, and seen early data about a new cystic fibrosis drug that was coming that looked like it would really help her. And as I've already talked about, we got involved in the clinical trial networks to try and get into these sorts of studies to benefit our patients. So we applied to be a site in this global multi-center clinical trial of this drug that was coming along, and we were selected as a site. And then we had to really struggle to make sure that Amy would be suitable and get into the study. So, for example, patients to get into the study had to be stable for 4 weeks prior to getting into the study. So no extra treatment during that time, no sign of a chest exacerbation during that time. They had to be stable at the start of the study, and we had to think carefully about her medications and what to give her to try and give her a period of stability. We had to give her IVs, obviously, just before that 4-week window to try and maintain the stability right through to day one of the clinical trial, and that needed a lot of lot of thought. But obviously we did that in conjunction with the family. And she was entered into this double-blind randomized control week trial, and she was one of 100 people with CF worldwide in this particular trial. And at the week 2 visit, I mean, obviously it was blinded, so we didn't know whether she was on active or placebo. But the lung function was not blinded to site investigators, and we could see that lung function had gone from 40% predicted to 75% predicted in 2 weeks. The young person and her mum both said that something changed. She's different. She's got more energy. She said it felt like a weight's been lifted off my chest after 2 weeks of taking this medication. She looked a better colour just in the clinic. And we weren't, as part of the clinical trial protocol, we weren't allowed to tell her what a lung function was. But we were able to say which direction it was going in. We said, your lung function is considerably better than it was at the start of the trial. And her mum started crying, and then Amy started crying, and actually I had tears in my eyes as well, because it just felt a miraculous moment for this family that we'd known for a long time, and we were really worried about this girl. And it was an amazing moment. And actually, I'm starting to get emotional just thinking about it again now. And it was traumatic. So from that very moment of starting that trial, she's not to this day needed another course of intravenous antibiotics since. She continues on the drug, which is now, many years later, funded and approved, having been proven in this clinical trial to work. It's a CFTR modulator drug, Kaftrio. And she's now cared for at the adult unit. She's recently celebrated her 18th birthday. And has passed the driving test, etc., and is off to university in great health, and that's really good. This is a picture of her in Spain a couple of years later, because she'd never been well enough to go on a foreign holiday, and was then able to do that. So no more hemoptysis, no more need for oxygen, life much more normal, lung function now within normal range, just amazing. So this is the benefit of clinical trials. This shows how clinical trials benefited this patient. If she'd waited on the NHS for this drug, it would have been another 3 years, and she might not have lived that long. There we go. And when they moved to the adult unit, they sent me these thank yous. So again, I've taken her name out of this card, but so this is from the parents on the left-hand side. So thank you for taking care of. Don't tell anyone, but you're her favourite doctor. Getting on the trial was touch and go, and I knew you worked very hard to achieve this, but wow, I'll always remember the first appointment we had after starting the trial. I'll never forget the look on our faces. We were all so amazed and very tearful at the results. I still get shivers thinking about it. I hope you feel very proud of yourself and what you've achieved for your patients. Never change, Dr. Lee. And then from the young lady herself to Dr. Lee, I just want to say huge thank you for everything you've done for me over the past few years. You are incredible, not only for everything you've done for me to get me onto the trial, but also for being someone I knew I could turn to at any time. I would never have made it this far if it wasn't for you. You've changed my life in an unimaginable way, and I will be forever grateful. We'll miss you so much. I'm not sharing that because I want to blow my own trumpet, but because I want to show you the power of clinical trials in real people's lives, because she embodies that. So just in closing, because I realise I'm at the end of my time now, I also want to say how interesting it is being involved in clinical trials. So the European Clinical Trial Network is now expanded. On this slide it says 57, it's recently expanded again, it's 73 sites now. We meet regularly twice a year. So I'm meeting in Brussels every January, and then a meeting wherever the European CF conference is. It's going to be in Milan this year, so I'm off to Milan in 3 weeks' time. And we meet for a day and we discuss all the clinical trials, and we hear all about the pipeline of clinical trials that's coming. It's really stimulating, and to share with lots of colleagues around Europe who have now become great friends as well has been brilliant. For 3 years, I actually was director of the network. So again, I got funded a day a week to do this job. That was absolutely fascinating. I had to travel a lot around Europe and indeed internationally to meet sponsors, do lots of Teams calls. Every 2 weeks, we had a 2-hour telco about all the studies, lots of protocol reviews, lots of documents to read. Really interesting, talking to pharma about all the studies that were coming on. So that was a great job to do, really enjoyed that. And we've had lots of reports showing the impact of of our networks in increasing awareness, access to clinical trials. So these are just people with CF in the UK. So 71% of CF patients in the UK have now spoken to their CF teams about clinical trials. 46% of people with CF in the UK have had the opportunity to consider a clinical trial. 85% of people that do go into a clinical trial feel it's positive, and 70% rate it as overwhelmingly positive. So that's very positive. And obviously in CF, you'll be aware that life expectancy and outcomes are improving all the time. So this is life expectancy along the left. This is years along the bottom. And obviously I mentioned I started CF in about 95. So life expectancy then was about 30 on average, but we were seeing teenagers dying of CF as well. Life expectancy now on CFTR modulator drugs for someone like Amy is predicted at around 80 years. So dramatic changes just in my professional career. These are the next drugs that are coming along in CF. So we've got 10% of people that don't respond to the CFTR modulator drugs. So we're looking at genetic therapies like mRNA therapies, antisense oligonucleotide therapies, gene therapies of all sorts of descriptions. And you can see that those are now coming into phase 1 and phase 2 in adults, and will be coming to children's clinical research facilities soon. So it's exciting times. I've had the opportunity to be involved in lots of international publications related to the clinical trials work. So these are a couple of recent publications that I've been on. I was first author on a study showing that the CFTR modulator just stops the lung function declining if you measure it over 4 years compared to decline when you're not on it. And how to best design clinical trials in this era of CFTR modulators, again, with some international colleagues. So that's been great. I've been able to sit on committees at the European Medicines Agency in Amsterdam. I've been to lots of conferences and various European and global investigator meetings. I do regular protocol review for the European CF Society Clinical Trial Network. So, preparing reports to send back to pharma about whether we think their clinical trial protocol is right or needs adjusting before it actually is put into practice. And that's really fascinating. Again, lots of confidentiality agreements involved in that, because obviously it's all commercially sensitive material. And I've been on to European Global Task Force and committees, which is great. So in conclusion, what I would say to you all, and hopefully I'm preaching to the converted if you join this group, but an academic career is very rewarding, fun, and full of variety. Being part of the CFTR modulator clinical trials is probably the most rewarding aspect of my entire medical career so far, I would say. Having an opportunity to lead on regional or European research organisations has been great. To develop clinical trial activity does need support, and financial support. You need to know where to get the money from, and it needs to be, I think, embedded within the clinical team. So looking at the funding opportunities is vital to develop significant clinical trial activity. Thank you for listening to me rabbit on for a bit. I'm very happy to take questions or discuss any of that. So thank you. Are you on mute, Farina?
Thank you, classic. Thank you for that. That was a really good journey to kind of like through your career. But were you interested in kind of like CF right from the start, and did you kind of like make your own opportunities as kind of like that step in, or was it kind of like just something that you fell into? Because I think a lot of people in the Yorkshire and Humber, they're kind of like they know what they're kind of interested in, but they just don't know how to take that step and how to first make contact and get into kind of like the basically on the train tracks of exploring their interest.
So is that like the early steps, like when I was at ST1 to 3, or which steps do you mean?
Yeah. So kind of like when before you did the was it the MRC kind of like PhD MD proposal, how did you take that step? Was it just that you were in that clinical environment, or did you like take up did you pave your own path? So that'd be kind of like, did you how did you get there?
I think I paved my own way a little bit. I think it was partly, and again, I'm a bit biased, but I think it was being on a postgraduate diploma in child health made me think more about research, and obviously that I had to do a research proposal. So I did that research proposal about the neonatal checks thing in Hull, which was Ruth Skelton's idea for a project, rather than my idea, I have to say. And I really enjoyed doing that. And then I thought, I really want to do research. I think it's really interesting. I got to present at the Royal College of Paediatrics meeting at the annual conference, and that was great to be quizzed in a big group of people and to present. Thought that was great. And then to get a publication, I thought it's really great getting a publication. I just thought, I want to do academic. It's great. So then I kind of pushed to get an academic kind of training fellowship kind of thing, what we called a lectureship in those days. And then I thought, what I really need to do is an MD and PhD, and I can't think of an idea myself. So let me go and meet some people and see whether they'd be keen to take me on, basically. And I went to meet that professor of medical medicine who somebody had said, they've got loads of ideas for projects, go and have a meeting with them. So I literally went in their office for half an hour. They said, you're just the kind of guy we need. I've got this scientist who's got this project lined up that you'd be great for. Put the two of us together, and it went from there. So what I would say is I don't think I've always been a great ideas person to develop my own ideas for projects. I'm maybe a little bit better at that now because I come up with ideas for other people and, you know, for trainees to do. But I think it was just thinking, I really want to do academic. Let's take opportunities to meet some people. And that's how it happened.
Well, thank you. Neil, do you want to ask a question? And then if anyone else wants to, then just put them into the chat and we'll keep an eye on that and get you to ask questions.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That was a really, really good talk and such a poignant story about the girl that you're calling Amy. I thought that was really emotional, and it's a difficult thing sometimes that I've seen done badly in regards to explaining randomization to patients during consent. And another way of thinking about that story was her life ended up depending upon a coin flip, and that had she been randomized to the placebo, she wouldn't be with us, which is scary. And from a population perspective, it's very easy to understand the importance of randomization and randomized controlled trials. But when you're trying to explain it to the patient that their treatment should be randomized, I've never really seen it done perfectly to a patient that's a little bit reluctant to go down that route. Have you got any tips and or phrases that you use when you're consenting to randomized trials to explain why the randomization is so important?
Well, that's a really important question, and obviously she's a good illustration of how to get it right. I think it's very, very important for people to be fully informed before they go into a clinical trial that there is randomization, and to explain how it works and what the chances are as well. So some trials will be 50-50 randomization. Some trials will be, have a different chance. They might have more active slots than placebo slots. So I would always say to the participant what their chances of being on the active treatment are. In her study, it was a little bit different in that we already knew, and it was in the consent documentation, that there was an open label extension study for all subjects that complete the initial 6-month trial. There would be the opportunity to then go on to open label, which would definitely be drug. So she did know that even if she was randomized to placebo, assuming that she got to the end of the 6 months, she would then get active drug by participating in the first part of the study. So there was, if you like, a kind of opportunities to get on drug at some point. But I do think it's very important to be really explicit with people. And some studies are wholly altruistic. some studies, like particularly the early phase studies, that might just be a 2-week study of a drug, and then you come off it because there's no way to do an extension study at that point because there's not safety data or anything. They have to analyze the safety from the 2-week study. There's almost no chance of personal benefit to those people, but they're doing it altruistically because they want these drugs to come to fruition eventually. I think in pediatrics generally we're in phase 3, and often there's a lot more safety data, and there's a lot more chance for individual benefit to the patients. Although you're right, if they're on placebo, they're not going to benefit in the initial part of the study. I hope that answers some of your questions at least.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you very much.
I take a lot of time over consent. So for these sorts of studies, obviously we make sure the patients get the written information at least, well, it has to be at least 24 hours before the consent is signed, but often a lot longer than that. I'll often have an initial chat with them over the phone about the study and what I think the potential benefits to them as an individual are, and the realistic downsides. More visits, more blood tests, more the other stuff, and any potential side effects there might be of the new product. And then the consent visit itself, I will take half an hour to an hour at least, just going through the whole documents with them and trying to explain it all to them, and really making sure they know they can leave the study at any time. So I say to them, if this afternoon you decide actually this isn't working out, this study, I don't want this to work out for my child, you could leave the study this afternoon, you can leave it tomorrow, you can leave at any point. And I also say, if we as investigators think at any time this trial is not in your child's best interest, we will tell you, and we will recommend that your child comes out of the study. And obviously we have to say as well that the sponsor may pull the trial at any time if the sponsor feels the study's not working out. The sponsor has a right to stop the study at any point. So all of these things have to be discussed as part of consent, but consent is so important to get right. I think it's harder for some acute trials. So, I'm aware of trials that recruit on intensive care units and so on. And I think that's more challenging consent environment than perhaps I have in cystic fibrosis.
Does anybody have any more questions? Just put your hand up or put it in the chat. Tim, if anyone's interested in getting involved in any of kind of like the cystic fibrosis research that you're involved with, or kind of like is happening in Leeds, how do they best? Who do they come like email you, or how do they best get started and get involved?
I'm very happy for people to email me. Absolutely. So if you want to get early experience of research, maybe involvement in some sort of project that might be presentable at a European conference or something like that, I'm happy to help with that. Obviously, we don't have 1,000,001 projects, but we've got a few project ideas that potentially people could do. If people want to see some clinical trial visits, you can come and see some clinical trial visits. Our participants will be very happy for you to see what goes on. Obviously, we'd have to get their permission, but I feel sure they'd be happy. And to get on the delegation is a bigger deal for commercial sponsors, because you have to fill in all sorts of forms, and there's a bit of a lead time. So generally, you have to be kind of working with us for 6 months or so for it to be worthwhile to actually become on the delegation log for a project for some of the commercial studies. But many of our pediatric trainees have done that and found it valuable. Just come and spend a day on the Children's Clinical Research Facility in one of our, certainly Sheffield or Leeds. There's a lot going on. So yeah, those would be my thoughts.
Are there any trials, not just in CF, but also kind of like in respiratory, that have the associate PI scheme at the moment? Or because like my knowledge of it is like all the neonatal trials, but kind of like, is there anything going on in kind of like the respiratory department where there are associate PI positions? Or
so we don't have anyone currently doing associate PI in respiratory, but I'm aware of the scheme and we have explored it. So we're happy for people to consider being part of that. Generally, that's more on academic studies than the commercial portfolio that I'm more familiar with. But yeah, we want to encourage people to get experience in research.
Brilliant. Does anybody have any more questions before we bring the session to a close?
Could I ask Neil a question? So Neil, I'm interested. Can I ask Neil a question? Because I'm interested in kind of, obviously you're on this NIHR post at the moment, and how did you get into that, and what are you doing on it? I'm just quite interested to hear.
I'm coming to the end of it now. Actually, I'm coming into the last 6 months. So I did the research and teaching fellowship job at Sheffield Children's, where you look after the medical students. And when I was interviewed for that, I was interviewed by Wendy Baird, who's got a lot to do with the NIHR Research Design Service, and she liked the idea that I had around the application of data science to registry work in relation to kids with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and so she gave me a lot of support with a lot of the other research design service people, and they were instrumental to me getting the NIHR Doctoral Research Fellowship, and they're national these days. If anyone does have an idea that wants some support, then you can apply to the RSS, I think it's called these days, the NIHR Research Support Services, and depending on what your idea is, they'll point you in the direction of the appropriate expertise, and they can be really helpful getting fellowships. And that doesn't have to be a doctoral research fellowship for a doctor. It can be other clinicians. So highly recommended. Yeah, I thought their support was fantastic.
Brilliant. And it sounds like your journey into academia was kind of similar to mine, that you had an interest and then got into the kind of teaching side at Sheffield Children's and then went from there. Yeah,
I did academic foundation and an academic clinical fellowship before that as well. So they were really helpful, but I wouldn't say they're mandatory, and you shouldn't really get put off if you haven't done that, because obviously you can't go back in time. But there's plenty of routes in. There's posts available for a Bassett Law research training fellowship if anyone wants to travel down to the south of Yorkshire, where you can get some research funding time alongside on-call commitments at a nice quiet DGH. So yeah, there's various other opportunities available.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you.
Right, I'm going to share the last couple of slides. Brilliant. But just before I do that, I just want to thank Dr. Lee for this really great talk, and for coming and talking to us today, and especially also for making it quite kind of like personal and interactive, by kind of like steering it towards our interests and kind of like where we are in our training. I thought that was really useful. But also just going on from what Neil said, kind of like opportunities that we've got around the region and the UK. So I believe that there's a clinical research fellow post in Leeds, which is currently being advertised for the September 2025 start. So there's a link on there. But if you also go onto the BRIDGE website, there's information about that, and we're trying to distribute it around the region, so not just the people in Leeds, but also kind of like around the region are aware of that opportunity. And there's also RCPCH Trainee Research Network Educational Series, so TREES, which is currently held every last Tuesday of the month at 1 o'clock. So you can kind of like join those sessions if you go onto the RCPCH website and type that in. Then you can find out a little bit more about that and benefit from that. And then here is our feedback form. So we're always grateful for feedback so that we can continue to deliver kind of like what you as trainees need and what you're interested in. And also if you've got anyone that you're working with or any ideas of things that you think will benefit other people in the region, please let us know, because then we can get in touch and we can organise sessions on your recommendations. So you could fill those feedback forms in. Be very grateful. Other than that, I will let you get on with your day, and also definitely if you thank you for joining us, and I hope that you've also enjoyed the session.
Yeah, it's been brilliant and lovely to meet you all, and good luck all of you with your ongoing careers. I'm happy to help any of you if I can.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.